What's up everybody? How's it going? Today we're going to be reshelling this original DS. This thing really isn't in horrible condition, but it has a broken hinge, which is a common issue on all DS's, specifically original DS and DS Lite. And it also has two screens that are starting to have dead pixels. This is also an issue that I see quite often, and I'm really not even sure why this happens, but the screens will need replaced. I can show a closer view of each screen, that way you guys can completely see what I'm talking about, because it's kind of hard to see, especially on the top screen here, but there is some damage up at the top. So in order to solve both of these issues, we're going to be replacing both screens as well as doing a shelf swap. Starting things off, whenever you're working on a handheld like this, I usually start by taking out the battery. There's only one screw holding the battery door down, so once you unscrew this, you should be able to lift it right off. It's kind of hard though, so you might have to flip it over like I did. Then from there, you can go ahead and remove the battery. I just use my fingernail. If you guys need a tool to be able to reach it, use like a plastic spudger or something. Don't use any metal tools, because if you puncture the battery, then you're probably going to have a fire hazard on your hands. And once you get the battery out, you have 7 more screws on the outside that need removed before you can take this bottom shell piece off. And once you get all those screws out, the bottom piece should just lift right off. Luckily, you don't have to worry about any ribbon cables here like you would on a 3DS. Next, I'm going to go ahead and remove all the board ribbon cables. This one I'm removing right now is for the bottom screen, and the two underneath of it, I'm not sure what the bottom one is, but I think the top one is for the digitizer for the touchscreen. Using a pair of angled tweezers like this really helps whenever you're trying to remove these ribbon cables. But you also want to be very careful to make sure you're not damaging the ribbon cables in the process. If you have any plastic tweezers, that might be better, but unfortunately I don't have any good ones, so this is the best thing I've got. But just be careful and make sure you're not puncturing the cable or ripping the cable. Now that we have the bottom cables out, we can go ahead and work on the top here. So this black cable here needs to come loose, and I believe it is for the wireless chip. It comes up pretty easy, you just want to pull straight up on it. And then after that, we just have one more ribbon cable up here at the top, and that is for the top screen. Again, just try to be very careful with it, because the cable is pretty thin. It's not the thinnest ribbon cable I've ever felt, thankfully, but they're still pretty easy to damage, so just be careful. Now that the cables are out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the screws so we can take out the motherboard. And there are 3 on the main part of the motherboard. Once you get those out, don't forget there is a 4th one up above the cartridge slot. Now we'll spin this around here so you guys can see it better. But it's right here, and don't forget this one because you might damage the board if you try to pull it up without removing that screw. Once you get all the screws out, you can go ahead and lift up on the motherboard, and you might also want to go ahead and take out the trigger buttons, especially because you don't want to lose the springs that are attached to them. So I would go ahead and take those out too while you're at it. And then from there we can go ahead and start removing the face buttons. Go ahead and take out these rubber pieces, and the D-pad as well as the power button is below this one, and you can just use tweezers to pull those out. And then on the other side, it is the A, X, B, and Y, and start and select underneath this rubber pad. And again, I would just use tweezers on these, it makes it a lot easier. Once you get those out, you also want to take out this clear plastic piece down here. And this is basically just a diffuser for the LED lights. That's your power light and your charge light. Then from there we can go ahead and remove the bottom screen and digitizer, and just give it a light press from the front, and it should just pop right out. The adhesive isn't very strong on these. Just make sure once again that you are very careful with the ribbon cables. Obviously in my case, I'm not going to be reusing these screens, so the ribbon cables attached to the screens themselves don't really matter to me. But if you are reusing the screens, you want to be careful with that, as well as the long ribbon cable that attaches the two screens. You want to make sure that you take good care of it as well. So next we're going to be disassembling the top part of the console, and I'll just go ahead and warn you guys, these rubber pieces here, there's 4 of them, they all need removed in order to get to the screws underneath. I don't know a good way of not destroying them to get them off, but again, I'm not reusing them, so I didn't really care in this case. But once you remove the 4 rubber pieces, you can go ahead and remove the 4 screws underneath. And then from there, once you remove the screws, you can go ahead and grab some kind of a pick like this and just kind of run it along the edge. There are a bunch of tabs that need broken loose, and you just want to run it all along the top and both sides, and then it should break loose from there. And now that we have this opened up here, we can go ahead and remove these 2 boards. The board on the left is the wireless board I was talking about, and then the board on the right is the board that attaches the top screen ribbon cable to the ribbon cable in the middle, and that basically allows it to be able to plug into the motherboard. So like I said earlier, I am definitely going to do my best to save this long ribbon cable in the middle, because as far as I'm aware, there are no issues with it. It's just the screens themselves that I'm having issues with. It's good practice just to try to be good and easy with all of the ribbon cables, that way you're not damaging them in case there is something you want to save. And once again, there are 2 ribbon cables, one big, one little, attaching to the top screen. That's because the top screen and bottom screen are the same. They're identical. So that's why if you ever go to look for replacement screens for the original DS, you'll find them most of the time labeled top or bottom. This confused me whenever I was first trying to find replacement screens for this, but after doing a little bit of research, I found out that they are indeed the same. Once you get the ribbon cables removed, you can go ahead and move these 2 boards, and you want to be extra careful because they are both attached to each other. And you'll notice that there are no wires coming out of these speakers. That's because all they are is pressure mounted against the back of the boards whenever the boards are screwed in. So because of this, the speakers will just pull straight out. Now we can go ahead and get the top screen loose, and since I'm not saving this screen, again, I don't really care if it gets damaged, but you do need to pry on it a little bit to get it loose. If you are trying to save the screen, I would definitely try not to pry it too much, or you might damage it. And now that the top screen is loose and out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and push out this hinge here, as I'm going to need to save it for the new shell. You can probably order replacements of these, and for some people it might be a good idea to do so, but I usually try to save these if I can. I will say these are definitely difficult to push out, but once you get it out far enough, it should just come completely loose. And next we're going to go ahead and get this connector for the wireless chip out, and you should just be able to fish it through. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get it on video, but there is a piece of the hinge with a screw on it that you can unscrew in order to get the middle ribbon cable out. So now that I have the console completely torn down and ready to go, we can go ahead and get out the new shell. I decided to go with a different color. I think this one looks pretty cool. There's actually not a lot of options when it comes to replacement shells with the original DS, like there are with DS Lites. So I was kind of disappointed to see that, but still, I think this color's pretty cool. And you guys will see in the end, it actually really looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and link it down below, but I got this replacement shell kit as well as both replacement screens off of eBay, and the replacement shell was a little bit pricey. I think it was around $25, and the replacement screens were actually pretty cheap. They were only 10 bucks a piece, but luckily everything I ordered to replace seemed pretty high quality. So I was glad to see that, because sometimes when I've ordered replacement DS Lite shells, they feel pretty cheap and flimsy, and luckily this one is pretty quality. I'm just going to go ahead and show you guys these screens real quick too, just so you can see that they are the same. And I actually got a little bit of a discount on them because I ordered two at the same time. So if you are replacing both screens, I would definitely buy them from the same seller, because some of them will give you a little bit of a deal if you order multiple. Now, to start with this new shell, I'm going to go ahead and put on the plastic screen protector for the top. You just want to be careful when you're doing this to not scratch the plastic, but you do have adhesive underneath of this, so that makes things a little easier. And you should just be able to put this straight down and it'll fall right into place. Just make sure it's pressed down real good so it doesn't come loose. And the other thing I want to make sure I mention is there is a layer of plastic film over this, so make sure you take that off whenever you are ready to play your new DS, because the plastic film layer on this one was pretty scratched up, and I was kind of worried it was the screen protector at first, but then I just realized there was the film over it and took it off, and it looked great. And once we get that on, we can go ahead and drop in the new top screen. And as you can see here, I'm used to working on DS Lites, because here I am dropping it in like this, and that's actually upside down. So you actually are technically supposed to install the top screen upside down, just like this, and this is the correct way to install the screen. You also don't want to forget this little plastic piece from the old shell. This will just help hold your top screen in the correct place. Unfortunately, I was struggling to record myself installing these ribbon cables up here, but you can see I actually made a mistake. The ribbon cable is not supposed to run under the board like this. It is actually supposed to run over the board like this. And I promise that I did fix this later on, but unfortunately I once again wasn't able to record myself fixing it in the video, just because of the angle of the board and the cables. It was pretty difficult to get on camera, but just make sure you pay attention to this and don't make the same mistake I did, because luckily I didn't damage the ribbon cable, but I easily could have. So now that we've got that taken care of, we can go ahead and rerun this connector for the Wi-Fi chip down through the ribbon cable, right like this. Now it's time to run the Wi-Fi chip connector as well as the long ribbon cable down through the bottom part of the shell. And this is pretty difficult. I once again recommend just taking your time with this and being very careful. You don't want to damage this ribbon cable. Be as gentle with it as you can, and it's kind of difficult to get through, but if you take your time, you'll get it eventually. And you can do the same with the connector for the Wi-Fi chip. Once you get those ran all the way through, you can go ahead and close this shell a little bit and line up the hinge, so you can go ahead and push in the actual hinge part of it, and make sure you just push it in as far as you can. It's pretty difficult. I think it's just since this is a new shell, but you want to make sure it's pushed all the way in, so that way everything closes up properly and your hinge doesn't come loose. And once you get that pushed into place, you can go ahead and put on the back part of the top of the shell. It should just snap into place. Just make sure all of the clips do snap into place so that way there aren't any loose areas on it. One other thing I want to do is clean this digitizer real good, since I am going to be saving this and reusing it. There were no issues with the touchscreen, so I don't see any issue with reusing it, and it's not particularly scratched up. If it was scratched up a lot, I would definitely recommend replacing it, but this one's not bad. I went ahead and got the new bottom screen as well as the digitizer reinstalled off camera. Again, I was struggling capturing it on camera very well, so I kind of just skipped over it. It's pretty self-explanatory, and I'm sure there are good guides out there that you can find for doing so. I just don't have the greatest way to record something like that. But now I'm just going ahead and putting in all the new buttons, and once all of the new buttons are in place, I'm going to go ahead and put in both of the new rubber pieces for the buttons. And I'm also going to go ahead and put in the new triggers. As you can see, there is a spring on the trigger that needs to be pressed down with it. It's a little bit difficult, but once you get it in place, it should stay. Just make sure you don't knock it loose whenever you're putting the motherboard back in. And whenever you do go to put the motherboard back in, it's kind of annoying trying to run these ribbon cables back through the board, but once you get them ran through, you can kind of just set it back down into place. Now, in order to make sure this motherboard isn't moving at all, I'm going to go ahead and put the screws back in. Just remember the screw that's supposed to go at the top of the cartridge slot, as well as the other three. And now it's time to go ahead and plug all the ribbon cables back in. Like I said earlier, these are pretty easy to break, and I would say they're easier to break whenever you're trying to put them back in. So once again, just take your time and make sure the ribbon cable is fully seated before you snap it into place. Otherwise, the DS is not going to power on. And once you get everything plugged in, you can go ahead and put on the bottom of the shell and get everything screwed in. So here you guys have it. This is the final product, and I think it turned out super nice. It definitely looks much better than it did before, and it even came with a replacement stylus and a replacement sticker. I really like the look of the Japanese stickers that they give in these kits. And one last thing I wanted to point out real quick that I think is pretty cool about this kit is the fact that there are two different colors of buttons on here. I think it goes pretty well with the color of the shell. So you already know I had to pull out the Classic to make sure that this DS worked good. And I gotta say, these replacement screens look great, especially compared to the old ones. That's one thing that has always bothered me, is picking up an old DS and it has the dead pixels on it. I think it looks horrible, and I gotta say the buttons feel really good on here too. I never realized that the original DS had clicky buttons, and I always prefer the clicky buttons, so I was pleasantly surprised to find out about that. So overall, I think this is a pretty cool console, but I've always been a DS Lite kind of guy, especially because it has brighter screens, and I think that's a must-have for something like this. But let me know what you guys think. Do you prefer the original DS or the DS Lite, or maybe even the DSi? I've not had a ton of experience with the DSi, but I think it's pretty cool too, minus the fact that they took away the Game Boy Advance functionality. But overall, I'd say it was a pretty successful repair, and this thing looks great. And I think Sonic agrees as well, because he says,